didn't start with explosions. It didn't start with speeches. It started with images. Images that spread faster than explanations. Convoys, smoke over a capital city, conflicting reports, leaders going silent. And suddenly, Venezuela, a country most people had stopped thinking about, was everywhere again. The question wasn't what happened. The question was why now? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Venezuela has been collapsing for years. Sanctions, shortages, power struggles, none of that is new. So why does it suddenly feel like the clock just sped up? To understand that, you have to stop thinking in headlines and start thinking in leverage. Venezuela isn't just a country, it's a pressure point. On paper, it's one of the most resource-rich places on Earth. Not theory, not potential. Proven reserves. The kind that don't disappear when prices fall, they wait. And for decades, those reserves were locked behind a problem no one could solve cleanly. Every attempt to isolate the regime created new dependencies. Every attempt to pressure it created new alliances. And every year that passed, Venezuela became less stable and more dangerous to ignore. That's the paradox. Weak states don't become irrelevant, they become volatile. When the global system is calm, volatility gets ignored. When the system tightens, volatility becomes a threat. And right now, the system is tight. Energy markets are brittle. Supply chains are stretched thin. Conflicts in one region ripple instantly into another. So when Venezuela moves, or when something moves around Venezuela, it's not just local news, it's a stress test. Here's what most coverage misses. This isn't about ideology anymore. That chapter ended years ago. This is about control versus unpredictability. Because a country with massive reserves, limited oversight, and growing desperation doesn't just affect itself. It affects prices, alliances, shipping routes, and political balance far beyond its borders. And when uncertainty reaches a certain level, powerful actors don't wait for perfect clarity. They move early. They move quietly. And they let the world argue about the surface while they secure the structure underneath. That's why the images mattered more than the statements. Official language is slow, markets are not. When reports start circulating, whether confirmed, denied, or under investigation, the signal is already sent. Something changed. And here's where people get it wrong. They assume this is about removing one man, one leader, one figure. That's a distraction. Leaders are replaceable. Structures are not. What matters is whether Venezuela remains a wild card or becomes predictable again. Because unpredictability is expensive. It forces hedging. It forces contingency planning. It forces power to stay alert. And powerful systems hate staying alert for too long. So when tensions spike, when claims fly, when visuals are released at just the right moment, it's rarely about convincing the public. It's about signaling to other players. Things are moving. Plans are active. Don't assume this stays frozen. And once that signal is sent, it can't be taken back. Now here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Every time something like this happens, the public is pushed into a false choice. Was it justified or was it wrong? That debate is loud, and it's mostly useless. Because the real decision happens just before that question ever gets asked. It happens when instability becomes more costly than intervention, when waiting becomes riskier than acting, when a pressure point stops being theoretical and starts affecting everything else. Venezuela crossed that line a long time ago. What changed is that the world around it did too. And once that happens, the question is no longer if something breaks. It's where the pressure releases first. There's a reason Venezuela keeps coming back into the global spotlight. Not every collapsing country does. Many fall quietly. They shrink. They fade. Venezuela doesn't. It sits there like an unresolved equation, not exploding, not stabilizing, just refusing to settle. And that's dangerous, because the most unstable thing in any system isn't collapse. It's limbo. Venezuela exists in a space where nothing fully breaks, and nothing fully recovers. And over time, that creates something worse than failure. It creates leverage. Think about what leverage actually means. It's not power. It's not dominance. It's the ability to force others to react. A country doesn't need to be strong to have leverage. It just needs to be positioned in the right place at the wrong time. Venezuela checks every box. Massive energy reserves, a fractured internal system, external partners with competing interests, and a population caught between survival and silence. That combination doesn't just create instability. It creates opportunity for everyone except the people living there. And here's the part most people underestimate. Venezuela isn't important because of what it produces. It's important because of what happens if it suddenly can produce freely again. Energy markets don't care about politics. They care about supply, predictability, and timing. A major producer coming back online, or going fully offline, doesn't just shift prices. It reshapes leverage across regions. That's why Venezuela is never allowed to drift completely out of control, but never fully allowed back into the system either. It's kept suspended, useful but contained, damaged but not destroyed. That balance didn't happen by accident. Every year Venezuela remains unresolved, it forces other players to hedge, to prepare, to keep options open. And options are expensive, so when reports suddenly surface, when images appear, when tension spikes faster than explanations, that's not chaos, that's pressure management. Because pressure doesn't release randomly, it's guided. Here's where things get uncomfortable. People want clean stories, heroes, villains, endings. But geopolitical systems don't operate that way. They operate on thresholds. How unstable can this get before it affects everything else? How long can this remain unpredictable before it costs more than it's worth? How much ambiguity can the system tolerate? Venezuela has been testing those thresholds for years. And when multiple thresholds get crossed at the same time, economic stress, energy insecurity, regional instability, suddenly what used to be too risky becomes necessary. That's when moves accelerate. That's when actions happen first, explanations later. And that's why the recent moment feels different. Not because something unprecedented happened, but because too many variables aligned at once. This isn't about one leader losing control. It's about the system losing patience, and systems don't announce impatience politely, they signal it. Through markets reacting before statements, through allies repositioning quietly, through narratives shifting from long-term issue to urgent concern. That's why the language changed. Not eventually, not ongoing, but now. And here's the mistake most viewers make. They assume this is the climax. It's not. This is the midpoint. The moment where options narrow, where flexibility shrinks, where every next move becomes harder to reverse. Once a situation reaches that stage, walking away stops being neutral. Doing nothing becomes a decision. And for powerful systems, indecision is often the most dangerous choice of all, because it allows others to move first. Here's the uncomfortable truth most coverage avoids. A broken Venezuela isn't a failure of the system, it's a feature. When a country stays unstable for long enough, it stops being treated like a nation and starts being treated like a variable, something to manage, something to adjust around, something to use. And once that shift happens, fixing the country becomes less important than controlling the outcome. Ask yourself this: if chaos was the problem, why hasn't it been resolved already? If leadership was the issue, why didn't replacing it end the story? If sanctions were the solution, why did they never produce closure? Because closure isn't the goal. Control is. A permanently unstable country does something very useful. It justifies constant involvement without demanding responsibility. You can intervene without rebuilding, pressure without stabilizing, influence without ownership. That's the sweet spot. And Venezuela has lived in that sweet spot for years. Every major move around it follows the same pattern. Tension rises, markets react, narratives harden. Then, nothing fully changes. Why? Because a fully functional Venezuela would create new problems. A stable energy producer would rebalance power. A politically independent government would renegotiate terms. A recovered economy would attract partners that weren't approved. Stability creates competition. Instability creates dependence, and dependence is predictable. Here's where people get it wrong. They think this is about punishment. It's not. Punishment ends when behavior changes. This is about containment, keeping Venezuela weak enough to need permission, but strong enough to matter. That's a very delicate line. And maintaining that line requires constant pressure, not too much. Collapse creates unpredictability, not too little. Recovery creates independence, so the system oscillates. Relief, then restriction. Dialogue, then isolation. Hope, then disappointment. Over and over. That's not indecision, that's calibration. And here's the most important realization. Once a country becomes a calibrated problem, no single event fixes it. Not arrests, not announcements, not images broadcast worldwide. Those are signals, not resolutions. Signals to markets, signals to allies, signals to rivals. They say, we're still managing this. That's why every breaking moment feels dramatic, but never final. Now zoom out. Think about how often this pattern appears elsewhere. A place rich in resources, a population struggling, external pressure justified as necessary, a future that's always promised and always delayed. Different maps, same structure, change the names, keep the playbook. And once you see it, it's impossible to unsee. Because this isn't about Venezuela anymore. It's about how power behaves when letting go is more dangerous than holding on. Here's the quiet fear inside powerful systems. If Venezuela stabilizes on its own terms, it proves something uncomfortable. That control wasn't inevitable, that the pressure wasn't required, that the system wasn't the only option. And examples spread faster than sanctions ever could. That's why resolution is scary. Chaos can be explained. Stability without permission cannot. So instead, you get managed instability, endless headlines, endless speculation, endless almost moments. Enough movement to feel like progress. Never enough to end the story. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to reverse. And because eventually people stop asking, how do we fix this? They start asking, how do we use this? That's the real turning point. And once that question becomes normal, the system has already won. Here's the problem with systems built on control. They work until they don't. For a long time, containment feels stable, predictable, clean, but underneath, pressure is building. And pressure doesn't disappear. It looks for exits. Venezuela was never meant to be fixed. It was meant to be managed. But management has a shelf life, because every system that relies on instability needs something very specific: attention control. People have to keep believing the story, that the situation is temporary, that the next move will solve it, that the system still knows what it's doing. The moment that belief cracks, containment turns into exposure, and that's where things get dangerous. Look closely at what's happening now. The language is shifting. The urgency is sharper. The images are louder. That's not confidence, that's stress. When power is calm, it moves quietly. When it's unsure, it performs. Big moments start replacing long plans. Symbols replace outcomes. Optics replace resolution. That's always the sign. A system that once controlled the narrative now has to defend it, and defense is exhausting. Here's the part most people don't want to admit. The risk isn't that Venezuela breaks free overnight. The risk is that it stops behaving like a contained problem. Because containment depends on predictability, predictable shortages, predictable reactions, predictable headlines, but unpredictability spreads. It forces recalculation. It exposes assumptions. It breaks old playbooks. And when one long-managed situation stops responding, others start asking questions. That's the real fear. Not rebellion, not collapse. Precedent. If one example escapes the pattern, it weakens every system built on it. That's why these moments feel so heavy, why every move feels loaded, why every statement sounds final, but never is. Because ending the story is riskier than extending it. So the system stalls, not frozen, just circling. Enough action to maintain authority, enough restraint to avoid consequences, but circles don't last forever. Eventually, resources thin out. Public focus shifts. New crises compete for attention. And that's when containment quietly fails. Not with explosions, with exhaustion. People stop reacting the way they used to. Markets stop responding the same way. Narratives lose their punch. The tools still exist. They just don't hit as hard. That's the silent breakdown phase. No announcement, no headline, just diminishing returns. And here's the uncomfortable ending. Systems don't collapse when people revolt. They collapse when they can't explain themselves anymore. When the story stops making sense. When the pressure costs more than the control. When managing the problem becomes harder than solving it ever was. That's where we are now. Not at resolution, not at peace. At a tipping point where every move reveals how much effort it takes just to keep things the same. Venezuela isn't the end of this pattern. It's a mirror, showing what happens when power relies too long on containment instead of closure. And mirrors don't lie. They just reflect longer than people expect. If this situation truly was simple, it would have ended already. The fact that it hasn't tells you everything, not about Venezuela, about the system watching it.